Can you believe there is an invisible line that divides Earth in two? A line that cannot be crossed by land animals, fish, or even birds. This line starts at Bali and ends near the southern Philippines. On both sides, the animals belong to completely different ecozones. On the left side of the line, there are tigers, elephants, and rhinos. On the right side, there are koalas, Komodo dragons, and kangaroos. Despite the extremely short distance between the islands. Why can't animals cross the line? Even birds. Why does this line divide Earth into two? How was the line discovered? Explained in this video. This line has mysterious features that block animals from moving to other places. How was it discovered? First of all, this line was discovered by Alfred Russel Wallace, and its name comes from his last name. He was a British naturalist, explorer, and geographer who carried out evolutionary studies independently from Charles Darwin. Between 1854 and 62, he collected many samples and identified numerous species in the Malay archipelago to support his theory of evolution. While observing species on the islands, he noticed critical differences between them. For instance, by traveling only 35 km from Bali to Lombok, he saw that mammals and bird species were completely different, belonging to another ecozone. After further research, he showed that the line marks distinct fauna specific to Asia and Australia. In 1859, he described the Wallace Line as separating animals from Asia and Australia. About 45 years later, Max Weber suggested that the Wallace Line was actually further west than previously thought. He proposed locating a equilibrium line between the Oriental and Australian regions within the Wallace region, based primarily on mammals and bird fauna. This view was named the Weber Line by Paul Peltier in an article published in 1904. Weber preferred not to define one strict boundary line, but rather to describe a transitional zone. Why can't animals pass to other islands? At first, it may seem obvious, because there's a sea. Animals cannot cross it. That makes sense. And this explanation is partly true, but the reality is more than that. If there is a sea between the islands, what about the ancient times, like the Pangea years? Back then, there was only one continent on the earth. Perhaps in those ancient times, there was no sea between the islands, because they were joined a single landmass. In that case, species could easily move across territories. So why didn't it happen, as you might expect? Yes, during Pangea, the lands were connected and animals could spread freely, but that was a very long time ago. After Pangea broke apart in the late Mesozoic, a deep ocean gap formed between the Sunda and Seoul continental shelves. In the Eocene, in the Paleogene period, this sea barrier became permanent and has existed for about 50 or 60 million years. Since this deep water never disappeared, there were no land bridges across valleys, and species could not cross by land. Over millions of years, they evolved separately. Primates and elephants in the west, marsupials, like kangaroos in the east. What about the fish? They already live in the ocean, so why can't they cross into the other area? Since marine animals are not affected by land barriers, at first it seems that these lines would not influence fish. However, interestingly, many fish species and groups also show different distributions on the two sides of the Wallace Line, especially for freshwater fish. The Wallace Line is a major barrier because freshwater species cannot cross the ocean to reach new rivers. In fact, on the Wallace Islands, there are very few freshwater fish from either Asian or Australian origin. The number of mainland-based freshwater fish in this region is very low, since it is difficult for them to cross the open ocean. The size of the trench is about 250 meters. For marine fish, the situation is a bit more complex. Reef fish and coastal fish usually live in shallow seas where continental shelves are found, since the Wallace Line lies exactly on a deep sea trench that separates two different shelves. Many fish populations living in shallow waters cannot cross this deep water barrier. In fact, the phrase animals and many birds and fish species do not cross this line is also used to explain that Wallace Line is partly valid for marine marine organisms. On the other hand, open sea fish or ocean species with wide distribution are not affected by Wallace Line because they can move freely on both sides of the ocean. In summary, the distribution of fish can also feel the effect of these biogeographic boundaries depending on their habitat preference. Fish communities tied to coastal and reef ecosystems develop differently on both sides, but ocean migrant species spread to wide areas, so the Wallace or Weber lines were not barriers for them. Why can't birds fly over to the other grounds? Many bird species, despite their ability to fly, do not cross even the narrowest stretches of open sea. On Bali, there are bird families of Asian origin: thrashfoos, woodpeckers, barbets, trogons, paradise flycatchers, fairy bluebirds, minivets, durongos, pheasants, and jungle fowl, but brightly colored birds are almost completely absent. On the other hand, on islands east of the Wallace Line is such as Lombok, Sulawesi, and Papua, the situation is opposite. Asian birds are absent, while Australian birds such as parrots, cockatoos, and lorries are common. Why could flying birds not cross? Many of the native birds in Bali are weak flyers, or even flightless species, for example, ground-dwelling galliform birds, or even forest birds that only fly short distance. These species spread to Bali by land during the last ice age when the sea levels were lower. When the seas rose again, they became trapped on the island because they could not fly or were too weak to cross long stretches of open sea. They never reached Lombok and stayed on their side. Many forest birds also show a behavioral barrier. They do not live dense forest habitats and will not cross wide stretches of ocean without seeing land. In this way, even a narrow 35-kilometer strait became a biological uncrossable boundary. As a result, Asian origin birds like kiwits, pheasants, and woodpeckers could not move east, while Australian birds like birds of paradise and cockatoos could not move west. This separation made the bird communities on both sides of the Wallace Line clearly different, but this does not mean there are no exceptions. Strong flyers and migratory birds were able to cross naturally. For example, some raptors, hawks, eagles, and swallows reached Australia from Asia on their own. Many water birds and shorebirds also fly long distances. Many waterbirds and shorebirds also fly long distance, are found on both sides. In general, birds with limited flying ability, small habitat specialists, and flightless ground-feeding birds, such as megapondes like the maleo, and various peafowl and pheasants, face the Wallace Line as a natural barrier, and their historical distributions were restricted by it. The Wallace Line, if you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe.